Today we meet Professor Saul Cohen, President of Queen's College of the City University of New York, previously Director of the Graduate School of Geography at Clark University. Somebody known to his colleagues chiefly for his writings in political geography, Oxford Atlas, and more recently a monograph on Jerusalem. In other circles, he is well known as an innovator in program development, curriculum reform, and a most efficient administrator and director. But few know that in combination with this public image and very strong and effective personality, there is somebody who understands personal dilemmas when they're presented to you and show enormous strength and support when asked. But how many of us know much about Saul the person? I would like to begin this morning's conversation by asking Saul to tell something of his background. What has inspired you? What has been influential in your own career development?
That's a tall question, Anne. I suppose I can start with the word books. I think the two books stand uppermost in my mind. I learned how to read both English and Hebrew through the Bible. The Bible was really the first book that I read. Parallel with that was Black Beauty. My father taught me both. And I still have an image, I think I was in the second grade, of having read either 32 or 36 books, I can't quite remember that, during a summer, walking back and forth to the library, and it must have been about a 2-mile walk, maybe a mile and a half. And then the teacher had given us a summer assignment, which was to write a book review of every one of those books. And I still remember it was a little orange book, and I managed to get about a half a page, probably 7 or 8 lines. And so I suppose being immersed in the book stands kind of uppermost in my mind.
Now this is Boston.
Well, yes, it was a suburb of Boston.
Huh?
Yeah, I was
and other
born.
children your age were into similar kinds of hobbies?
Well, my sister used to take me to the library. She was 5 or 6 years older. She was much more interested in music. You know, I had, as most kids my age, I had the abortive attempt at the piano and the violin, and then realized that books were a little more to my style, whereas my sister remained a pretty talented musician. Yeah.
How big a family was it?
Well, just my sister and I, and my father and mother. We moved to Boston when I was about to enter the 7th grade, and it's kind of interesting. The basic reason for the move was so that I could be sent to the Boston Latin School. See, if you lived outside Boston, I think you had to pay more to go to Boston Latin School than you had to pay to go to college. In fact, I'm sure that's the case. And so we made the move. And going to the Latin School really was, for children of low-income families, was tantamount to getting into Harvard College if you could succeed in Latin School.
I see.
So that was really, it was the 7th grade that was the critical test, and not college. So I spent 6 years at Latin School and acquired what I think was a very solid liberal arts education, classical education, the best sense of the word. I've always appreciated it. I made dear friends in those days with whom I've maintained contact ever since. These last couple of years here at the college, when we've reintroduced a variety of college-wide course requirements, I think that I lean very heavily upon my early junior high school and high school education for support. And then I entered college.
Great. Could you describe that Latin school a little more for those of us who don't know much about the educational philosophy behind it? Was it private school?
Oh, no. The public Latin school is the oldest public high school in the United States, founded in 1635. A very traditional school, 6 years of Latin, 3 years of Greek, and other languages, just the the cross-the-board English, math, and classics, and was, until recent demographic changes in Boston, was the major feeder for Harvard. When I entered Harvard in 1943, I believe that about 100 of my classmates were admitted to Harvard. 100. I think the entering class at Harvard at that time was a little over 1,000. And most were, many, I would say most, but many were commuters. And many of us never applied anywhere else because you had no choice.
It was expected.
It was expected, and one didn't have the money to conceive of going to a residential college outside of the Boston area. And if you didn't get into Harvard, then you went to BU or Northeastern at a different level. As a matter of fact, I was a residential student rather than a commuter student, but largely due to the GI Bill of Rights, not largely, exclusively.
Because you had been to service, you had been in service.
Yes, and as I entered for a half a year, and then I entered in the service, and when I came back, I remained as a resident student. So I did all of my work at Harvard.
But to go to Harvard, was it that was important, or did you already know which lines of study you wanted to?
Oh no, I had no idea what I wanted to study. As a matter of fact, I assumed that I was going to become a lawyer. And when I graduated college, I was admitted both to the graduate school at Harvard and to the law school. And my parents assumed I was going to go to the law school, and I sort of did.
What made that change?
And the first day of class, I walked into the law school. It's a very large building, Langdale Hall, central building, and then turned right and walked out another door and walked across the street and went to Professor Whittlesea's office and said, "I'm here. I'm going to go on with graduate school." And you say, what made me do it? I don't know. I don't know what makes people do certain things at a particular moment in time. Obviously, I was attracted to the idea of teaching, and I think that's what made me do it. It also may have been that Whittlesea was very much a role model for me. And remember, he had practically no students, so that he could lavish a great deal of attention on the few students that he had.
Yes.
I don't think there were more than 2 or 3 students with whom he worked, and when I was with him, I mean graduate students in general, and I was the only one in political geography at that time, so I think that had a lot to do with it.
Yes, so you were one of the few privileged people who worked closely with Whittlesea. I presume Ullman would have been another.
Yes, I mean, my working with Ullman is one of
Whittlesea's associates also.
Well, remember that there was another generation, a slightly older generation. There was Jones, Ackerman, and Ullman.
Yes.
When I was studying graduate school, Ackerman and Ullman were already teaching. They were based at the School of Planning at that particular time. Jones was already at Yale. I didn't get to meet Jones until after I'd gotten my degree, and then Whittlesea put me in touch with Jones. And I'm of the George Lewis, John O. Jelly, Saul Cohen generation. And there were a couple of others who were around at the time, coming in and out. But Whittlesea was an exceedingly shy person, a very courtly person. I never knew what an avocado was until he had us up. He used to have us up for Sunday soirees. So I learned something about avocados from him. I learned a little bit about fine wines, not from him, but from Harold Kemp. Harold Kemp, the gentleman who taught the legendary Geography 1 course at Harvard, and really whose major interest in expressing sort of person-land relationship studies was to talk about vineyards and direction of sun and slope. And he used to write travel books. I didn't learn that until much later when we became friendly, but he had a whole slew of travel books that he wrote under a pseudonym.
I didn't know that.
Yes, European travel books.
For heaven's sake.
That was Harold Kemp.
Yes.
But I suppose that directions would have taken a very different turn had I been allowed to pursue 2 degrees. I had an interest in taking both a law degree and a degree in geography in terms of doing something in international law.
Yes, this would have been the political interest that
That's
you've
right.
always had, yes.
Because I had done as much work in political science as I had in geography at college. But those were not days when law schools in particular were interested in encouraging students to take 2 degrees. As a matter of fact, I went to the then eminent professor of international law at Harvard, very old man by then, I think he was over 80. G. Manley Hudson was his name, and asked him whether it was possible, and he looked at me and said, "Young man, you'd better make up your mind. If it's the law you want, you go to law school." Certainly, anyone coming with that kind of request today would be welcome with open arms at most schools of law in the country. So things have changed, at least in terms of an openness in education, which didn't exist at that time. But going back to the question, why did my feet turn right?
Yes.
And cross the street? Partly this issue of being interested in teaching, partly because I was always interested in geography. I go back, my first geography teacher was in the 6th grade. She was a Norwegian. As a matter of fact, and all that I can remember of that course, and I liked it, was that I had a huge piece of paper, yellow paper, it must have been 4 by 5, and I drew a map of Norway. So I spent about 2 weeks on that. And then I had a 7th grade teacher who was a Boston Brahmin, very interesting kind of person, unhappy person. Later we discovered he died of alcoholism. I didn't even know what the word alcoholism meant at that time. But he was a person who had the means to travel. He was an explorer type.
I see.
An amateur explorer. And so got to learn a little about the excitement of adventure from him. And I suppose that those 2 formative experiences were useful.
Yes, well, they certainly seem to have come to flower in your atlas work.
Well, the atlas work is, yes, I was very poor in graphics directly. I used to struggle with Irwin Royce's course.
Yes.
We all had to take his.
Rice was at Harvard at that time.
Rice was at Harvard at that time. Never had an appointment directly. He was always appointed in the institute, not at the university.
I see.
And he was an artistic genius in many ways, as we know.
Yes.
So many of his works. Like his map of the Middle East,
Yes.
Physiographic map. The satellite showed us that he was pretty much on the button in terms of his intuitive view of that region. Yes. And he could draw with both hands and so on. And I was the one who always would spill the ink after I'd worked about 2 hours. But that aside, when David Bickmore called me out of nowhere, I remember distinctly the evening I was at a party, and I suddenly got a call from England. You know Bickmore,
yes.
Don't you? And a voice which simply said, "We've never met, but would you be interested in helping us to edit a new atlas for the American market?" And I didn't know why he turned to me, but I realized afterwards he certainly wasn't looking for any kind of cartographic.
No, it was another sense. Yeah.
He was looking for an educational feedback person, because he had gotten into this notion of the stacking principle, the notion that a map should be able to, a map in an atlas should be able to provide what overlays normally provide. And the issue really had to do with how much information could the mind and the eye absorb, and what sort of information could we put on a map. And then that took us into the issue of color as a way of conveying information. It was a marvelous period. I used to go back and forth, and we would debate over his experimental maps. I think we ended up with a major coup in that atlas. It was a great artistic success. Yes. In retrospect, it's clear that we put too much information on those maps.
Wonderful for teachers, though, because it can be a resource. You can tell the students to do a project, just retrieving the data from that atlas.
Yes. Exactly.
Yes.
So that's how I got into that, and I had a lot of fun with that particular
I knew that. Speaking
project.
of the phone call that he gave you, I recall getting a phone call from Prince Edward Island one time.
From me?
Yes, yes. Which sounded very like the one you just got from London.
Well, was I at a party, or were you at a party?
I was at a party. No, that was one line. The other, the political geography, did that allow you to bring up some of these law interests, and at least in a geographic context, to pursue some of those things which initially may have been what attracted you to law?
Well, I thought in the beginning that I was going to be interested in boundaries and in the legal aspects of boundaries. And for the first few years that I taught, and I did some writing, I did move in that direction. But actually, I became, I think I went through two different phases of interest beyond the boundary one. First of all, I became very close to a man named Andrew Georgi. I don't know whether you know that name, but Andrew Georgi, who had a refugee from Hungary, and a political scientist, had done his doctoral dissertation at Berkeley on German Geopolitik. And of course, Whittlesea had done a great deal of work in that particular area, a great deal of critical work. And I'd sort of left that behind until I met Georgie. We were colleagues at Boston University. And for about a 2 or 3 year period, we taught together, we collaborated. It was due to his influence that I spent a year teaching at the U.S. Naval War College. And I became interested in global strategic problems, an interest that I've maintained ever since. And then a second kind of phase, coming much later, was the interest that I developed in looking at geopolitical systems, which really tied in more with what I learned in the literature from the Chicago Political Science School than from what I had done with Whittlesea, although it's kind of interesting that almost everything I've ever done, if I look back into the earth and state, I can find allusion to it. It's just that we use different words now. But Whittlesea was a very clear thinker, a real intellectual, in a field where, I'm going to exclude you, but I will include myself, there are all too few intellectuals like you and like Whittlesea, and I don't regard myself as having the kind of breadth. Whittlesea was steeped in history, in the classics, and I guess those of us who get trained from a political science background always end up as narrower, unfortunately, although I've tried to make amends over the year by learning something about psychology.
Yes. That shift between the formal interest, boundaries, maps, zones, and the systems interest, it's a sort of shift that happened in many branches of geography, pre- and post-war. But I have a suspicion that a few people like Whittlesea and John K. Wright had already played with that tension of pattern process, if you will, and so on, long earlier. And some of the Harvard people were pioneers of the move away from the map world to a mechanism. Was there something in that Harvard education that moved you toward an interest in systems? Can you remember?
Well, you know, Ullman was, as you know, a very interesting person, almost a character in many ways.
Oh, he was a marvelous person.
We would sit and wait for him. He would always come late into the class,
Yes.
and he would have a whole bundle of materials. And then he would begin to look for something, and 20 minutes could elapse before he finally spoke.
Sounds familiar.
Sometimes he would pull a pipe out of his mouth, sometimes he wouldn't. And one would sit there to take notes, and maybe a page and a half of notes would emanate from a class with Ullman. And this might be after I'd come from a class with, let's say, a scientist like Louis Hartz, political scientist who spoke 10 miles a minute and would be scribing 7 or 8, 10 pages per lecture of Frederick Merck and the history of the American West. And one would sit, look at the notes, and then wonder, well, what's it all about? I mean, are we spending all of this government money as GIs to listen to this? But I would go over his notes afterwards, in later years in particular. And of course, it's much easier now to say if you can get one idea per class,
Yes.
lecture for one person, you've learned a tremendous amount. Now, Ullman dealt with systems in a very elegant and simple way. And I think that, although Ackerman did too, but I think that I got more from Ullman in that sense than from almost anyone else. And of course, both he and Ackerman were influenced by Whittlesea. So yeah, I think.
And perhaps World War II. That's my other big question to you as a political geographer. Do you think the World War II itself perhaps influenced that move? Ackerman, Ullman, all these people were commanders. And the world from the air is very different than the world from either the liner or the train. And you had these air age perceptions of the world.
Well, you know that Ackerman was involved in the occupation government of Japan, and he did the plan for the economic recovery, the agricultural economic recovery of Japan. I don't think that Ackerman's worldview was a top-down view. I really think Ackerman was very much an empiricist, gathering data together and then seeing what he could do with those data. Whittlesea was much more of a theoretical, deductive person, and so was Ullman. But from Ackerman, there was a period of my life when I got interested in marketing geography.
Yes.
Now, there was no connection between the courses I took with Ackerman and economic geography and the work that I did in marketing geography, except for the fact that the methods that Ackerman employed, this kind of painstaking amassing of data and then trying to find patterns in those data, probably did help me link up with William Applebaum, who kind of became my mentor in this particular area. Of course, I think I learned a lot more than certain techniques. This sort of opened up the other world to me, the world outside the university. I think if I've learned how to become a manager, I hope in the best sense of the word, it's partly because of these tremendously complex managerial worlds, which Bill Applebaum helped open up.
So you really do ascribe that to that period. That's a surprise to me.
Oh yes.
I mean, I would have
in terms of what you would describe as administrative interests and flares.
Yes.
There is nothing like the experience of being called in by a big corporation as a consultant to do what they know has to be done, but aren't prepared to do themselves because of the internal political or psychological situation. And when one has to, it wasn't so much the studies that we made, and we certainly made an endless number of studies, but rather the question of what do you do with those studies, and how can you get the institution to implement those particular studies, a very complex process.
And you found that exciting?
Yes,
a really
I did find that exciting.
Yes.
You know, that was a period when I was able to do a great deal of traveling. I always felt embarrassed at collecting a consultant's fee because at the same time someone was paying my airplane ticket. And as you know, I was at BU in those days, and you could get one ticket a year to go to a meeting, and that was the end of it. Unfortunately, that is still a condition of all of us in the academy, that one ticket. Whereas having that kind of access really made a big difference to me.
I'd love if we could move into that area now. That was obviously one of the big dreams of your career, to really work at education and curriculum reform in a way that was more than just delight in management, your own managerial ability. There were always fundamental social values involved in the programs you have helped to initiate. I'd love if you spoke a little of that.
Well, I used geography during that period as a stepping off point in many ways, rather than just as a focal point. You may have seen it from a different viewpoint because I helped involve you in the process of rebuilding, and I think we did rebuild the School of Geography, and I hope made it at that period one of the least geographical of schools of geography, in the sense that we did not...
The least traditional.
Least traditional. Well, I'm using geography as a traditional field. We were always cross-disciplinary without having the tools of other disciplines, and we tried as much as we could to introduce those tools. But I had become interested in certain general problems of American education in the 1960s. I discovered the schools, and I worked for a long time, maybe 10, 12 years, in a wide variety of programs trying to improve American education. I think, like so many of us who were involved at that period, we started off in a very naive way of thinking that the answer was to improve curriculum and develop teacher-proof packages. And I had a hand in the high school geography project. I had a hand in the Commission of College geography. But I think it became pretty clear to all of us that that was not the way to go. And therefore, I became much more interested in the teacher training aspects of those times. And that was an attempt to kind of blend what we knew about curriculum with what we didn't know about teaching, and to begin to learn about teaching. And there I became influenced much more by people outside the field who had very different views and understandings. The only thing I knew about pedagogy before that period was through a course that I had taken with George Renner at Columbia. You know that I studied at Columbia for a couple of years
I was wondering
as a
what the
part-time
connection-
student. I'd come to New York, and I was enrolled at Harvard. But Whittlesea had said to me, go there and take a couple of courses with Renner, he says. Whittlesea didn't think very much of Renner's writings, felt that they were not conceptual and they weren't particularly well-grounded, but he said he's an interesting teacher. And he was a fascinating teacher. In fact, Renner once told me, this was the period when the Department of Harvard was about to be closed, he said, they made one terrible mistake there. They didn't bring in someone like me to teach the undergraduate course and interest hundreds of students in the field of geography, and then they could go on and do their research. This is his view.
They needed somebody like Martin Clark.
That's right. I remember Renner, since he was based in Teachers College and not at Columbia College Columbia University, he taught a couple of courses in geographical education. I once took a course with him, so I can still remember Pestalozzi. That's
Yes.
about it. But most of my understanding of some of the educational problems that we face came from working with people who were in educational philosophy, educational psychology, or psychology, both at Clark and outside. I think during my days at Clark, I learned a lot from all of you who were in the school, but I think I learned more from working with two experimental psychologist friends, one of whom Bernard Kaplan is really humanistic psychology in the best sense of the word, and the other was an experimental psychologist who has become much more humanistic over the years. Seymour Wapner. Of course, we've become we've been very, very close friends all these years. We still learn from each other. We write to one another. I had Bernie Kaplan down here just 2 days ago for a full-day seminar with certain faculty and administrators on the whole issue of the connection between intelligence and language, the kind of things that one gets into. And the other person who has influenced me tremendously is a man named Seymour Saracen, who was at Yale. He's a psychologist. Again, he is someone who struck off in new paths in psychology. He would describe himself as a humanistic psychologist in the best sense of the word. And he and I have been working in this area of human resource networking now for, I'd say 10 or 11 years. We've written a book together. I've involved him. He's here as a visiting professor this year. We have a marvelous demonstration school that we have established with the Board of Education of New York. And he has been working with our faculty on that school.
Can you describe that resource networking project a little more? Explain.
Well, this goes back to, I think, about 1972. It's 10 years now. In Washington, I had worked over the years with another dear friend, Donald Bigelow. Now, Donald Bigelow, I think you've met him. Donald Bigelow was the only really non-educator who was able to remain in the educational bureaucratic establishment over the years. He just retired this year after 20 years. He was an American historian, but he plunged into that Washington period of reform. He's the one who got me involved in many of these educational issues. And we had both struggled with the question of curriculum and teacher training, and then the issue of how does one address the problem of minorities, and then what is a minority, moving from minorities in a cultural sense to minorities who are handicapped people, and then finally discovering that there are no minorities in life, that we all have something to learn from one another. But it was also at a period when the federal money was running out.
This was in the 70s.
Yes, the guns and butter issue had been resolved, and we had chosen guns rather than butter. And so many of the programs in which we had invested so much of our time and energy were simply dropped by universities. They were ready to take the money as long as the contracts and the grants came. When it was over, it was over, and it was like pouring water in the sands. The university faculty who were working with the schools went right back to their classrooms. There was no more overhead, no more release time. And we thought there had to be a better way of handling this, and we felt that the biggest problem was the money. That is, that if you pay individuals to do something, then the moment the pay ends, they leave. And so we hit upon this notion of trying to engineer what people do naturally anyway. That is, trying to could one engineer resource exchange on the assumption that there is always a basis for exchange. Someone has something to give someone else as long as there is a mutuality to it. And it was at that I had known Saracen casually, but Bigelow brought him to a meeting in the South. He always used to like to meet in the South. We hit it up in many ways, not the least of which was that Saracen was a Clark PhD. Clark psychologist, yes, he and his wife. And as we talked things through, we felt that one could engineer the natural flow of exchange, not by setting up a system, which regulates and monitors and keeps an account book of what did you do for me and what did I do for you. There's always that ledger is always in one's mind in terms of human behavior, but you don't have to put it in a book as long as you develop enough confidence in one another. And so we cast about the country looking for places where a human exchange network had already been started, and where we thought that we could observe what was going on. And we found one. In fact, we found one in northern Westchester County, started by a remarkable lady named Elizabeth Meyer Lorenz. Now, what we discovered, and I think that's obvious now, is that one can't, the anthropologists have tried it, you just can't sit on the side of the hut and watch the natives going through their ritual and recording what they're doing. What we discovered was that we had to become directly and intimately involved, because if we were trying to get something, namely some sort of insights into how the process was working, we had better be prepared to give something, to participate. And we have from that day till today. Mrs. Lorenz is involved in a number of projects here at Queens College now, and she has involved us, people in Westchester and in Washington and all over the country. She calls me every single week. Still, 10 years now, she's been calling me for advice.
This is an alternative, something that could work without externally induced stimuli, as it were.
That's right.
It can work on the basis of its own inner needs and possibilities.
Sure.
But how widespread could you envision that becoming?
Oh, I think since it's something that we all do naturally, I think it is as widespread as the human condition. You know that even now I understand that some of the contacts that I helped establish between that Westchester group and Clark remain. Because at one point there was a school class which needed help in designing an instrument. They were doing some kind of survey research job. I think it had to do with what youngsters wanted to do in summer jobs and how they felt about them. And if you remember Bob Baker, the psychologist at Clark, well, I brought him in. They came up for a day, and then they invited him down, and from time to time they maintained that contact. Our friend Harry Schwartz, I brought him down there for a day because there was an environmental class which was interested in measuring the impact of pollutants that were running off into a local reservoir. And Harry gave them some notions on how to proceed in terms of measurement. Now, they didn't pay Harry Schwartz back directly, but there's always a triangularity, if not more than that, in life. And there are things that I've helped Harry Schwartz of his interest, which fed back. So I think that networking is, it's with us. It's important for us to try to recognize it, and it's important for us there are certain things that we can engineer in it.
That sounds awfully subversive, Saul. I mean, we know this NEH and NSF and all the organs of nation states, both sides of the Atlantic. It's one very powerful way of controlling education is through the grantsmanship and the curricular reform and all those kinds of things that you're involved with. And you've come out of a period of intense involvement with that, government-sponsored projects, and you say, we got to do it on our own. Am I understanding you correctly?
Well, when I say we have to do it on our own, nothing can ever be done on our own. That is, everyone has to. You get help where you can find it, okay?
And you would still take federal help for that kind of resource networking?
Oh, but I wouldn't. First of all, that kind of resource networking doesn't need, for every dollar that we used to pour into local activities, if you had a networking approach, it would probably cost you 5 cents.
Yes.
That's, so I'm a pretty hard-bitten, cost-effective type of a person. I'll take 5 cents. But I won't take the dollar because I know what the dollar does to you. It means that you have an artificial stimulus. And when the dollar is gone, the project is gone. You know, when I talk about engineering networks, the most important thing that has to be engineered is the openness of a system.
Can one engineer open?
Yeah, and that's the real dilemma. Can you engineer openness? But I think you can. That is, you can engineer it, for example, by seeing to it that leadership is rotated. You can engineer it by making sure that you open the boundaries, that you deliberately invite people to come in and out. You can engineer it by making sure that one topic does not monopolize an agenda. That is, you can have a system where people can sit there, and even though they're not particularly interested in that particular topic, they're willing to wait, because eventually the topic will come around to something that interests them. Now, that's not easy. A lot of people are very nervous, and a lot of people are very selfish of their own times. But that's what I mean when I talk about engineering, this kind of interaction.
Yes. We had many debates when you were at Clark about the top-down versus bottom-up approach to things. And it seems to me you've moved a little bit more toward the bottom-up in those years. But your project still, you're using engineering language. Why do you say engineering systems rather than creating communication networks? Have you ever thought about the words you're using?
Sure, I've thought about the words that I use, and I think, I'll tell you why I deliberately use it, because it's, the whole problem is a very elusive kind of a problem. And by the process, by its very nature, is very elastic, elusive, plastic, you name it. And therefore, in order to try to get some kind of control over the situation, I think using a word which suggests that it's not a helpless and hopeless process, that is, that it's a process which has a dynamic of its own without any possibilities for human intervention and mediation. And that's where I think, engineering does suggest that there is a mediating role.
Well, it's semantic, basically.
Yes, but it's deliberate.
Yes, I gathered that. That's why I asked you the question. Yes. Now, in this period of very tight budgets and so on, all the goodwill in the world isn't going to enable people to have more time in their daily schedule for this kind of thing. Do you anticipate that the lean years are going to see a flowering of voluntary networks like that, or a diminishment of them?
Well, if I were to say that I think they'll see a flowering, that will suggest that I subscribe lock, stock, and barrel to President Reagan's current philosophy. I do think that there'll be more of a flowering. First of all, I don't accept the proposition that most people work up to their maximum. I don't think that's true at all. I don't even know what maximum is. You can try to measure, now you're being the engineer, maxima by number of hours work. What does that mean? Doesn't mean anything. Productivity, the intellectual sense in particular, defies this kind of measurement. I am convinced of one thing, and that is that by and large, in the university, where we live a good life. We have a great deal of freedom with our time. Because we have that kind of freedom, we have time to divert. And we can decide what's important, what's more important or less important for us to do. If you told me that we were in a profession where we have obligations, formal obligations of 70 hours a week, I'd say, well, some real problems here. Now, I think most of us do work 60 or 70 hours a week. But there's a lot of choice in what we do and how we do it.
Yes.
I wouldn't want to use the word productivity.
Let's hope that we can see such a development. I must say that it has been a most enormous privilege to work in a department with a strong leader, a strong director like Saul. We had many disagreements, and you terrified me on occasion. But in retrospect, I think it was a fascinating combination of strength and sensitivity, and encouragement to us to do what we could do. Thank you very much for this conversation.
Well, thank you very much for letting me talk this way.
Good, good. Thank you.
Okay.
She gave me this.